Have you ever felt trapped in a life that wasn't your own, where every choice seemed to be made for you? In this heartwarming yet emotional story, we follow a young girl named Susan, whose world was overshadowed by her father's controlling ambition. But amidst the darkness, there's always a glimmer of hope. With the support of her loyal maid, Helen, and the love of her mother, Dorothy, Susan finds the strength to fight for her own happiness and freedom. From moments of deep sorrow to the excitement of rediscovered love, this journey will take you from the depths of despair to the joy of a new beginning. Stay with us until the end to witness how Susan's life transforms from hopelessness to happiness. If you are not subscribed, I recommend you subscribe and activate the bell so you don't miss any videos. Every night, after the world around her fell silent, the young girl would quietly sob into her pillow, her tears flowing like a river of sorrow. The maid, who had grown to care deeply for the girl, noticed the dark circles under her eyes and the sadness that lingered in her gaze. Determined to uncover the cause of the girl's pain, the maid decided to feign sleep one night. She listened intently, her heart pounding in her chest, as the stillness of the night was suddenly shattered by the sound of the father's sinister actions. The realization of what was happening behind closed doors filled the maid with an overwhelming sense of dread, fear gripping her soul. Earlier that day, a sleek, black car glided smoothly to a halt in front of the imposing entrance of the Moore mansion. Charles Moore, ever the picture of authority in his crisp business attire, stepped out with an air of practiced elegance. He circled the car with a rigid precision, opening the door for his daughter, Susan, whose weary eyes bore the heavy burden of another grueling day. "Come along," Susan, Charles urged, his voice laced with a cold urgency that masqueraded as paternal concern. "Tomorrow brings another rehearsal, and you must be in peak condition for your modeling career." Susan, her steps sluggish and spirit weary, barely managed to respond as Helen, the loyal maid, met them at the entrance. Helen's embrace enveloped Susan in a warmth that seemed to speak the words her lips could not utter, a silent communication of love and understanding. "Oh, my sweet child," Helen cooed, her voice a soothing balm to Susan's tired soul. "You look so exhausted today. Let me make something special for you, something to lift your spirits. Yes." The affection in Helen's voice was a rare and precious treasure in Susan's world, a world dominated by cold expectations. Charles observed the tender exchange from a distance, his eyes narrowing as he called out, "Helen, remember the diet. No indulgences tonight. Susan's figure must be flawless for the judges. It's what's best for her future." His words, though seemingly in her interest, were tinged with an unyielding authority that left no room for argument. Clinging to Helen, Susan whispered, her voice trembling with unspoken desires, I wish everything was different, Helen. I wish I could choose my own path, my own dreams, choose to be with Mom." Susan's quiet plea was a desperate cry for a life beyond the confines of her father's ambitions. Helen, guiding Susan towards the kitchen, whispered back, her voice filled with a nurturing yet resilient strength, "I know, my dear, I know. But remember, the darkest hours come before the dawn. Your spirit is unbreakable, Susan, no matter how much they try to cage it. I'm here with you, always. You are not alone." Helen's words were more than just comfort, they were a solemn promise, a pledge of unwavering loyalty and protection. As Charles Moore stood silently, watching the bond between his daughter and the maid, his mind churned with thoughts of unfulfilled dreams and the relentless pressure he placed on Susan to achieve the success he had never known. His desire to see her succeed was a reflection of his own fears and failures, casting a long shadow over his relationship with his daughter. "She'll thank me one day," Charles told himself, his thoughts a mixture of conviction and denial. "When she's on top of the world, when she's somebody important, all this hardship will be nothing but a distant memory, just a small price to pay for greatness." He was convinced that the path he had forced upon Susan was the only one that could lead to success, as if any other possibility simply didn't exist. But in the quiet corners of the mansion, far away from Charles's cold, calculating gaze, the kitchen became a sanctuary. It was a place where warmth replaced the chill of ambition, where Helen and Susan could share a moment of peace, a brief escape from the pressures that loomed over every aspect of Susan's life. "Let's see if we can find something that won't make your father give us one of his disapproving looks," Helen said, her hands moving skillfully through the cupboards. "But it still has to be something that brings a smile to your face." Susan stood beside her, helping prepare a simple salad that somehow felt like a luxury in a world where indulgence was forbidden. As they worked, Susan's thoughts began to pour out, her voice soft but heavy with the weight of her emotions. "Helen, sometimes when I'm up there, on that stage, with all those blinding lights and eyes on me, I feel like I'm drifting further and further away from who I really am. It's like every step, every forced smile is just a part of something I never chose, something that isn't even mine." Helen paused, her gaze resting on Susan with a depth of understanding that only years of experience could bring. Her voice was gentle yet firm, carrying a wisdom that Susan clung to. "Susan, my dear, don't ever forget who you truly are. No matter how many stages you walk across, no matter how dazzling the dresses they put you in, your essence, your spirit, is far more valuable than any title or recognition they could ever offer. And I'll always be here to remind you of that. Always." Their conversation brought a rare sense of joy into the otherwise silent mansion. For a brief moment, the kitchen was filled with laughter and the sharing of dreams, a stark contrast to the suffocating ambition that ruled the rest of the house. In that small space, they created a world of their own, one of warmth, love, and hope. As the night drew to a close, Susan climbed the grand staircase, the echo of her footsteps a reminder of the loneliness that haunted her life. Yet, as she reached the top, a wave of gratitude washed over her. She turned back towards the kitchen and whispered, "Thank you, Helen, for everything." Downstairs, amidst the quiet clinking of dishes, Helen heard her. She smiled, a smile filled with the promise of better days. "Good night, Susan. Dream sweetly," with the angel she whispered back, her words carrying a reassurance that transcended the moment. This exchange, though simple, had become a nightly ritual, an unspoken acknowledgement of the bond they shared, a bond strong enough to weather the storms that Susan was bound to face. It was a quiet strength, a silent vow that no matter how harsh the world outside became, Helen would always be there to protect the girl she cared for so deeply. After bidding goodnight to Helen, Susan closed the door to her room slowly, leaning against it with a heavy sigh. The weight of her reality pressed down on her as she sank onto the edge of her bed. Why does it feel so hard to live this life? She wondered, the question swirling in her mind like an unrelenting storm. The glamorous world of modeling seemed glamorous to others, but to her, it was an endless burden, one she wasn't sure she could continue to carry alone. "I just want to be understood," Susan whispered into the silence of her room, her voice breaking under the weight of emotions she had long kept hidden. Surrounded by the gleaming trophies and glistening sashes that were supposed to symbolize her success, she felt more distant from herself than ever before. These objects of supposed achievement felt like shackles, each one a reminder of the life she never chose. "I just want Dad to see that these contests and fashion shows are destroying me inside. They're not my happiness, they're my prison." The vast emptiness of the mansion seemed to absorb her words, her plea lost in the grand, lonely space. Susan's longing for understanding felt like a plea into the void, a desperate cry that reverberated off the cold, unfeeling walls. Only Helen, with her nurturing gaze and unwavering support, seemed to truly understand the turmoil inside her. Helen always understands, Susan thought bitterly. But she's the only one. If only Mom were here. If she were here, things would be different. She would get me out of this prison, she would know what to do. Her words hung in the air, disappearing into the oppressive silence that filled every corner of the mansion. Meanwhile, across the house in her modest room, Helen was preparing for bed, but her thoughts remained with Susan. The girl's haunted expression, the heaviness in her voice, these things weighed on Helen's heart. That poor girl has so much potential, so much light within her that's being smothered every day. Charles doesn't see it, or maybe he just doesn't want to. Susan needs freedom, a chance to be herself, not this molded version of what everyone expects her to be. Even in the quiet darkness of her room, Helen felt a surge of determination. A silent promise bloomed within her, a vow to do more to help Susan find her way, to help her break free from the chains that bound her. She couldn't just stand by and watch this bright spirit fade. As the night deepened, the mansion wrapped itself in an almost eerie silence. But through the stillness, the muffled sound of Susan's soft sobs escaped her room, drifting through the grand hallways like a haunting melody of sorrow. The quietness of the night only seemed to amplify her pain, making the lonely sound of her crying all the more heart-wrenching. In her small room, Helen tossed and turned, unable to find peace. The distant, broken sobs crept into her sleep, stirring her from her restless dreams. They're just dreams, she tried to tell herself, clutching her blanket tightly. Just sad dreams reflecting my own fears and worries about Susan. She's fine. She has to be fine, but deep down, Helen knew better. Those cries were real, tangible echoes of a reality she desperately wished she could change. They were the sounds of a girl who felt trapped in a life not of her own making, a girl whose spirit was slowly being suffocated. By the time dawn arrived, the soft light of the sun began to seep through the windows, bathing the mansion's corridors in a gentle glow. Yet the echoes of the previous night's sorrow still lingered, like shadows that refused to dissipate with the light. Helen, as always, was the first to rise. She moved through the quiet mansion with careful, deliberate steps, preparing breakfast in the same routine that had become second nature to her. But today, something felt different, and urgency had taken root within her heart. Susan, too, woke with the first light, though her face still bore the traces of the tears she had shed in the privacy of the night. Her eyes were puffy, her cheeks stained with the remnants of grief. Slowly, she made her way to the mirror, hesitating before facing her reflection. What she saw staring back at her wasn't the glamorous image that the world expected, but a girl tired of fighting, tired of living a life that didn't belong to her. As Susan stood before the mirror, a quiet resolve began to build within her, a longing for something more, something real. The weight of the world still rested heavily on her shoulders, but deep within, a flicker of hope remained, fragile yet persistent. And though the road ahead seemed uncertain, Susan couldn't shake the feeling that, somehow, she would find her way. With or without her father's approval, she would discover what it meant to be truly free. "Today is a new day," Susan whispered to herself, though the words felt more like a fragile wish than a resolute declaration. She desperately wanted to believe in the strength behind them, to harness some kind of courage for herself, for her mother's memory, and for Helen, the one person who seemed to believe in her even more than she believed in herself. With a deep breath, Susan descended the stairs, drawn by the comforting aroma wafting from the kitchen. Her steps, hesitant and weary from a sleepless night, gradually softened as she caught sight of Helen bustling around the warm, familiar space. "Good morning, Helen. It seems you've already started working your magic here," Susan said, a small but genuine smile tugging at the corners of her lips. The kitchen was always a haven, a place where Helen managed to weave her quiet magic into the atmosphere, turning it into a cocoon of warmth and care. Helen turned towards Susan, her smile even brighter, radiating a warmth that filled the room. "Good morning, dear. I thought today we'd do something special for breakfast. After all, Saturdays should be about relaxing and recharging. How do pancakes with honey and fresh fruit sound?" Helen's offer wasn't just about the food, it was an act of love, a gesture that went beyond the kitchen. It was her way of reminding Susan that even amidst the pressures and chaos of her life, there could still be moments of sweetness and comfort. The suggestion felt like a small rebellion against the rigidity of Susan's routine, an invitation to embrace a rare moment of ease. Susan settled at the kitchen table, her eyes following Helen's graceful movements as she prepared breakfast. "You always know how to make things better, Helen." "I don't think I've ever told you how much I appreciate that," Susan said softly, her words carrying a weight that lingered in the air. It wasn't just casual gratitude, it was a confession, a deep acknowledgement of the light that Helen brought into her life, illuminating even the darkest corners. As they shared breakfast together, the conversation flowed effortlessly between them, weaving through topics both light and profound. They talked about simple weekend plans, but also about the dreams and desires Susan rarely allowed herself to voice. Helen's attentive listening encouraged Susan to open up, to express the parts of herself that were usually buried beneath her father's expectations. In these moments, it was as if the heavy weight on Susan's shoulders lifted just a little, allowing her a brief glimpse of what freedom could feel like. But as the clock neared noon, the atmosphere subtly shifted when Charles Moore joined them for lunch. The easy, light-hearted mood that had enveloped the kitchen began to change, as if a cloud had moved over the sun. The presence of the family patriarch brought with it an almost palpable tension, the kind that lingered just beneath the surface of every interaction. Helen noticed it immediately, her senses sharpening as she prepared herself to smooth over any potential conflict. She had always been attuned to the delicate balance in this household, ever ready to protect Susan from the harsh edges of her father's world. Lunch began with the usual pleasantries, the conversation revolving around trivial matters as they all danced around the unspoken topics that weighed heavy on their minds. But then, emboldened by the morning's warmth and Helen's quiet encouragement, Susan decided to broach a delicate subject, one that had long been avoided. She glanced at Helen for reassurance before turning to her father, her heart pounding in her chest. "Dad," she began, her voice trembling slightly but steady with determination. "I've been thinking about Mom a lot lately. Could we visit her soon? I really miss her." Her words hung in the air, the silence that followed almost deafening. It was a moment of vulnerability, a plea for connection, and a small rebellion against the unspoken rule that certain emotions and memories were off limits. Susan's request was more than just a desire to visit her mother's grave. It was an attempt to bridge the widening gap between her and her father, to open a space for the dialogue they had both avoided for so long. She hoped, perhaps naively, that this could be a step towards understanding, a way to mend the fractures in their relationship. Charles Moore, clutching the napkin with unnecessary force, responded in a tone so firm that it left no room for debate. "Susan, we've been over this. Your mother is not a topic for discussion right now. You have everything you need here, right in front of you. Dwelling on her only distracts you from what really matters." His words were like a closing door, locking out any possibility of a deeper, more heartfelt conversation. Helen, standing nearby, felt a pang of sadness in her chest at the sight of Susan's face, now downcast, her eyes filled with the familiar resignation that came after every harsh word from her father. Susan lowered her head, accepting the reprimand without protest, though the hurt was visible in the way her shoulders slumped. Helen's instinct was to step forward, to intervene, to speak up for the girl, and remind Charles of the irreplaceable value of maternal love, of the bond that should never be overlooked or belittled. But she knew the rules of the mansion, understood the unspoken boundaries of her role as the maid, and remained silent, her heart heavy with unexpressed words. In the tense silence that followed, the mention of Susan's mother lingered in the air like an uninvited guest. Charles quickly seized the moment to redirect the conversation, steering it back toward more comfortable and familiar territory, Susan's obligations and expectations, and his gaze swept over the table with a commanding presence, as if surveying a battalion under his command. and he fixed his eyes on Susan with the intensity of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "Now, about your schedule today," he continued, his voice layered with authority. "We have a full day of preparations ahead of us for the upcoming fashion show. And let's not forget, Susan, we need to reevaluate your diet and personal care regimen. I've noticed you're overeating again. And your hair is looking unusually dry. We cannot afford any imperfections. Maintaining an impeccable image is absolutely crucial." Each of his words landed with the weight of 1,000 burdens, pressing down on Susan's spirit like stones being added to an already heavy load. She stared at her plate, no longer able to summon the desire to eat. In her mind, a storm of thoughts and emotions whirled: anger, frustration, sadness, but all of them remained trapped behind a wall of fear and the relentless need to avoid conflict. She knew too well the futility of arguing with her father, so she swallowed her rebellion and chose the path of least resistance. "Understood, Dad. I'll try harder," she whispered, her voice so quiet it barely broke the surface of the tense atmosphere. It was an act of compliance, a forced submission that only thinly veiled her deeper yearning for freedom, for a life where she could be true to herself. Helen, who had witnessed this exchange in silence, felt a surge of indignation mixed with helplessness. Her heart ached for Susan, and within her, a quiet flame of rebellion burned brighter, fueled by her desire to protect the girl from the endless cycle of criticism and impossible expectations that seemed to define her existence. How does he not see it? Helen wondered, her thoughts racing with concern and frustration. How does he not see the damage he's causing? Susan is so full of potential, so alive, yet all he sees are flaws where he should see brilliance. But what can I do? How can I help her see her own worth when she's surrounded by this constant negativity? The meal ended in a heavy, somber silence, with each person retreating into their own thoughts. Charles was the first to rise, his mind already focused on his plans for the day, leaving behind an unspoken trail of expectations that weighed on Susan like a shadow. He strode toward the living room with purpose, leaving the kitchen in an atmosphere of quiet defeat. Once Charles had left, Helen approached Susan, who remained seated, lost in her own thoughts. The weight of her father's words still lingered in the air, but Helen was determined not to let them crush the girl entirely. With gentle movements, she sat down beside Susan, her presence a quiet comfort. Helen could feel the fragility of the moment, knowing that anything she said now would need to be handled with the utmost care. She reached out, placing a comforting hand on Susan's shoulder, preparing to offer the support and understanding that she knew Susan so desperately needed, even if the world around her refused to provide it. "Susan, when you mentioned your mother today, I could see something in your eyes, something deeper than just missing her. Your mother, Dorothy, she must have been incredibly special to you, wasn't she?" Helen's voice was soft yet full of concern as she initiated a conversation she knew Susan needed. It was more than just a casual question, it was an act of love, a gesture to show that she cared deeply about what Susan was going through. Susan looked at Helen, her eyes wide with a mix of surprise and relief. Finally, someone was willing to listen, to acknowledge the emotions she had kept buried for so long. "Yes, Helen," she began, her voice trembling slightly but gaining strength as she spoke. "She is special. I think about her every single day, but my father, well, you saw how he reacts. He refuses to talk about her. After the separation, he insisted that staying with him was the best thing for me. He said he had the resources and the know-how to give me a better future." The words spilled out faster now, as if they had been trapped inside her for too long, and Helen's presence offered a safe space for them to finally be spoken. Helen nodded, absorbing each word with deep empathy. She could feel the weight of Susan's emotions, the sadness that hung between every sentence. "I understand, dear. It's a complicated situation, but I want to know, how did your mother feel about all this? About you staying with your father?" Helen's question wasn't just curiosity, it was a gentle probe into the heart of the matter, a way to help Susan navigate her feelings, and perhaps even find a way to bridge the gap between her and her mother. Susan let out a sigh, as if releasing a burden that had been sitting on her chest for years. The memory of those moments seemed to weigh heavily on her shoulders visibly drooping as she recalled the past. My mother. She was devastated, Helen. She didn't want to let me go, but at the time she didn't have much of a choice. My father was right, in a way. He had the money, and my mother was struggling to rebuild her life after the separation. She told me it was just temporary, that we'd be together again soon, but that never happened. Since I was 16 years old, I've been waiting for that promise to come true. Susan's voice grew softer, her words heavy with the sorrow of an unfulfilled dream. The pain of a broken promise echoed in her every word, a hope that had slowly faded into the background of her life. Helen reached out and gently took Susan's hand, offering her silent comfort in the way only Helen could. "Susan," she said softly, her voice filled with quiet strength, "I have no doubt that your mother loves you. That love hasn't disappeared, even with all the time that's passed. And maybe, just maybe, there's still a way for the two of you to reclaim that lost time. Life is full of unexpected twists, and love has a way of finding its path, even through the hardest of times." Helen's words carried a sense of hope, a belief that perhaps things weren't as final as they seemed. She wasn't just offering comfort, she was planting a seed of possibility, a glimmer of light in the darkness that had surrounded Susan's heart for so long. "Maybe it's time," Helen continued gently, "that we start thinking about how to make that reunion happen. Your mother may be waiting for you just as much as you've been waiting for her." For a moment, Susan looked at Helen with a new spark in her eyes, as if the idea of reconnecting with her mother had breathed fresh air into a part of her soul that had been suffocating. It was a fragile hope, but it was hope nonetheless, a chance to reclaim what had been lost and to rewrite the story she had believed was set in stone. Helen's words were more than mere comfort, they were a silent promise, a pledge of unwavering support. It was as if she had taken an unspoken vow to stand beside Susan through whatever lay ahead, to help guide her back to the mother whose absence had left such a deep void in her heart. Each word exchanged between them wove a delicate thread of hope into Susan's soul, binding them together in a shared mission. For the first time in a long while, Susan felt that she was not alone in this journey. With Helen by her side, perhaps, just perhaps, she could find her way back to Dorothy, the mother who had always been her safe haven. Their conversation, intense and emotionally charged, finally came to a close as the reality of the day's demands began to creep in. Susan knew she had to prepare to accompany her father for the scheduled activities, a routine that had become synonymous with pressure and expectations. As she gathered her things, Helen observed her with a mix of pride and concern, seeing both resignation and a flicker of determination in Susan's eyes. "Helen, thank you for everything. I don't even know how to." "Well, just thank you," Susan said, stumbling over her words. The depth of her gratitude was so immense that it felt almost impossible to fully express it. She wished she could say more, do more, but for now, all she could manage were those few simple words. Helen smiled warmly, her eyes soft with understanding. "You never need to thank me, dear. I'm always here for whatever you need. And let's keep thinking about what we talked about, okay? Everything will work out, you'll see." She tried to infuse her words with as much optimism as she could muster, though her heart ached at the thought of Susan walking out that door, returning to the pressures of her father's world. Suddenly, Charles's voice cut through the moment, sharp and impatient. "Susan, we're late." "Let's go." His command was like a jarring reminder of the reality they couldn't escape. With one last shared look, Susan turned and headed towards her father's voice, leaving Helen standing alone in the room, her thoughts a swirling mixture of worry and determination. As the door closed behind them, The sound seemed to echo in the silence that followed, leaving Helen with nothing but the quiet company of her thoughts. There was much work to be done around the house, and while Helen's hands remained busy with cleaning and organizing, her mind was elsewhere, turning over possibilities and ideas. She knew she had to find subtle, creative ways to improve Susan's life within the constraints they faced. Charles was not an easy man to challenge, but Helen's love for Susan fueled her determination. As she wiped down the dining room table, an idea began to form. Maybe I could arrange for Susan to spend more time in the garden, she mused aloud, thinking of the way Susan always seemed a little lighter, a little freer when she was outside among the flowers and trees. She's happier out there, away from all the pressure. But as quickly as the thought took root, doubt followed close behind, casting a shadow over her optimism. But what about Charles? He would see it as a distraction. No, that wouldn't be enough. Later, as Helen folded Susan's clothes, the weight of her thoughts settled more heavily. Each familiar gesture felt imbued with new significance, each neatly folded item a reminder of how much she wanted to protect the girl she cared for so deeply. Another idea emerged. What if she tried talking to Charles directly? Perhaps she could make him see how much Susan needed more freedom, maybe even convince him to let her visit Dorothy. The thought seemed promising for a brief moment, and hope fluttered within her. But then reality struck, and Helen shook her head, frustration rising like a bitter tide. Who am I to him? Just the maid. He would never listen to me, not about something like this. He'd brush me off as if I were nothing, especially when it comes to how he raises his own daughter. Her thoughts darkened, and she felt the weight of her limitations pressing down on her. Still, despite the doubts that gnawed at her resolve, Helen refused to give up. She knew she couldn't fight Charles directly, but there had to be another way, something subtle, something that would allow Susan to breathe without causing a confrontation. She would keep thinking, keep searching for a way to bring a little light into Susan's life, even if it had to be done in the quiet, unnoticed ways that only someone like her could manage. As Helen continued her chores, her mind whirled with thoughts of potential plans. With every sweep of the broom, every dish she washed, a new idea formed, only to be quickly followed by doubts. What if I started small? She mused. Maybe I could convince Charles to let Susan choose her own outfits for the fashion shows. That might help her feel more in control, more connected to her own identity. But as always, reality reared its head, reminding her of the obstacles in her way. He'd probably dismiss me, she thought, a frown creasing her forehead. He'd say I don't understand the world of fashion competitions, and honestly, he wouldn't be entirely wrong. Later, while tidying up Mr. Moore's office, Helen stumbled upon some documents. She had no intention of prying, but one particular paper caught her eye. It wasn't just any document, it contained something that made her pulse quicken. Written there was Dorothy's address, Susan's mother. Helen stared at it for a long moment, her thoughts racing. I should write this down. I might need it someday, she decided, thinking far ahead, imagining all the possibilities this information might unlock. She carefully copied Dorothy's address onto a small piece of paper and discreetly tucked it into her pants pocket, as if it were a precious secret. As the day drew to a close, Helen found herself alone in the quiet kitchen, a cup of tea cradled in her hands. The stillness of the house seemed almost oppressive, weighing on her as she reflected on everything that had transpired. Each plan she had come up with during the day now seemed so fragile, so tenuous in the face of the cold reality she was up against. Every idea was full of potential pitfalls, and the obstacles loomed so large that she couldn't help but question whether anything she did would make a difference. Am I just fooling myself? Helen wondered, the sense of helplessness growing within her. Maybe there's no way to change things. Maybe I'm just clinging to false hopes. But even as the doubts swirled around her, Helen knew she couldn't give up. She had to try. For Susan's sake, she had to keep fighting, no matter how hopeless it seemed. The alternative, doing nothing, Watching as Susan's spirit continued to wither under her father's control was simply unthinkable. As the evening wore on, Helen couldn't shake the heavy atmosphere that seemed to settle over the mansion. In the back of her mind, she kept hearing the faint sound of crying from the night before. Was it just a dream? She questioned herself, troubled by the memory. What if Susan really does need me, and I'm just convincing myself it was all in my imagination? The thought weighed heavily on her, a responsibility that far exceeded her normal duties as a maid. Determined not to let sleep overtake her too easily that night, Helen resolved to stay awake, listening for any signs of distress from upstairs. The house gradually grew silent as the hours passed, but Helen remained alert, her senses on high alert. Maybe I'm overreacting, she thought, trying to calm the storm of anxiety brewing inside her. Susan is fine, she's just tired. That's all it is. But just as she began to relax, the deceptive calm was shattered by muffled sounds of a heated argument. The voices were distant, the words hard to make out, but the tension in them was unmistakable. Helen's heart raced as she strained to listen. This isn't right. What's going on up there, she asked herself, a surge of dread tightening her chest. Confrontations between Charles and Susan weren't unusual, but something about the intensity of this one sent alarm bells ringing in her head. Without hesitation, Helen rose from her chair, moving toward the stairs with the practiced stealth of someone who had spent years navigating the mansion without a sound. Her concern for Susan overrode any thoughts of propriety or hierarchy. I'll just check, she told herself, justifying her actions, just to make sure Susan is okay. As she ascended the stairs, her movements were light and deliberate, her heart pounding in her chest. She knew she was crossing a line, but the need to protect Susan to ensure she wasn't being hurt was far more important than any rules about privacy or her place in the household. The voices grew louder as she approached the second floor, and Helen braced herself for whatever she might find. As Helen approached Susan's room, the sound of crying became unmistakably clear, cutting through the quiet of the mansion and striking straight into her heart. Each sob was a desperate plea, a cry for help that seemed to echo in Helen's own soul. She stood frozen outside the door, her hand hovering near the handle, torn between her instinct to intervene and the harsh reality of her limitations as a maid. Oh, Susan, she thought, her mind racing. How can I help you? How can I protect you if I can't even fully grasp the depths of what you're going through? She hesitated, her mind a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. If I walk in now, what will Charles say? How will Susan feel, knowing that I've heard everything? But how can I just stand here and do nothing, with her crying like that and the anger in their voices? Helen battled with her sense of duty and her overwhelming protective instinct, feeling the weight of the choice she had to make. Standing just outside Susan's door, Helen felt each word that passed between father and daughter like a knife. The argument that had seemed muffled and indistinct from afar was now painfully clear, the harshness of their exchange cutting through the air like shards of glass. I can't take this anymore, Dad. I've had enough. Susan's voice trembled with desperation and frustration, but there was also an undeniable strength in her words. I don't want to be a model. I don't like it, never did, and never will. The raw emotion in her voice shattered any semblance of calm, revealing the deep pain that had been festering inside her for so long. Charles, however, responded with the same unwavering authority that he always wielded, his voice cold and unyielding. You don't understand, Susan. This is for your own good. The rehearsals, the shows, the diets, everything. You need this to be someone, to secure your future. His words were not comforting, they were commands, as if he were speaking to a subordinate, not his own daughter. But I'm miserable. Dad, Susan's voice cracked under the weight of her tears. This is killing me inside. It's not the life I want, but you've been forcing it on me for so long, and I'm exhausted. Her cries were laced with agony, her soul laid bare in a way that Helen had never heard before. It wasn't just physical fatigue, this was emotional and psychological torment. Charles's reply was chilling, devoid of any empathy or fatherly concern. "If you don't start following my instructions, I'll have no choice but to take more drastic measures. I'll reduce your food intake even further, and you'll be cut off from any contact with the outside world. You need discipline, Susan, and if I have to force it on you, so be it." His words were calculated, delivered with a disturbing detachment that made Helen's blood run cold. "You can't do this to me. This is abuse." Dad Susan's voice reached a new level of anguish, her defiance intermingled with a desperate plea. "I wish Mom were here. She would never have let this happen." The pain in her words was palpable, a cry for rescue from a life she felt trapped in, a life where her voice was silenced. Outside the door, Helen's heart pounded in her chest, disbelief and horror coursing through her veins. She could hardly believe what she was hearing: Charles's threats, Susan's pleas. It was a nightmare she could no longer ignore. "This has to stop," Helen thought, her resolve hardening with each passing second. "I can't let this go on. I have to do something." Without thinking any further, Helen turned and ran down the stairs, her footsteps echoing loudly through the empty house. She knew that what she was about to do could change everything, but the knowledge of Susan's suffering propelled her forward, giving her a courage she hadn't known she possessed. Reaching the landline phone in the kitchen, Helen's hands trembled as she picked up the receiver. Her fingers hovered over the numbers, but there was no more time for hesitation. She dialed quickly, her heart pounding in her chest. The phone rang, and with each ring, Helen's determination grew stronger. She knew that what she was doing could have serious consequences, but in that moment, nothing mattered more than protecting Susan. "Police, please. It's an emergency." Helen's voice cut through the tension in the room as soon as the operator answered, her words trembling yet firm. She knew that this phone call was a line she couldn't uncross, that by taking this step, she was setting in motion something irreversible. But the conviction that she was doing the right thing, protecting Susan, pushed her forward, steeling her resolve despite the storm of emotions inside her. She took a deep breath, forcing herself to remain calm. "I need help. There's a situation here where I believe a child is in danger. Please send a patrol car quickly," she said, trying to convey the urgency without letting the panic in her heart take over. Could you please provide more information?" the operator asked, their voice calm yet attentive. "We need more details before dispatching a unit. Anything you can tell us would be helpful." Helen closed her eyes for a moment, gathering her thoughts before responding. "It's the daughter of the house owner, Mr. Moore. He's being extremely strict with her, forcing her into a career she doesn't want, controlling her food, her life. I just overheard a very intense argument. There were threats. I fear for her well-being. Please, someone needs to check on her." "Understood, Ma'am. We'll send a team right away," the operator reassured her, their tone shifting to one of urgency. "Please stay safe and try not to intervene until we arrive. We need you to stay at the location if possible." When Helen hung up the phone, she felt a wave of relief wash over her, but it was quickly followed by anxiety. She knew she had done the right thing, yet the uncertainty of what would happen next gnawed at her. Every second seemed to stretch on interminably as she waited, the silence of the house amplifying her worries. She imagined all the possible outcomes, the potential fallout from her actions, but there was no turning back now. She had taken the steps she believed would protect Susan, and that was all that mattered. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the sound of approaching vehicles reached Helen's ears. The flashing lights of the police car illuminated the front of the mansion as she hurried to greet the officers at the entrance. "Please come in," Helen said, her voice steady but laced with urgency. "It's about Mr. Moore and his daughter, Susan. I've been holding this in for too long, and now, I think it's time someone stepped in." She guided them into the house, her heart pounding as she led them towards the heart of the problem. One of the officers, a tall man with a firm posture but kind, understanding eyes stepped forward. "Mr. Moore," he called out, his voice authoritative yet calm. "We need to have a word with you. Concerns have been raised by your maid regarding the treatment of your daughter. It's important that we discuss this." Charles appeared in the hallway, his face a mix of shock and irritation. He clearly hadn't expected this intrusion, though deep down, perhaps a part of him had feared something like this would eventually happen. His expression hardened as he approached the officers, but Helen could see a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. She watched from a distance, her hands trembling slightly as she clutched them together, praying that Susan would finally receive the help she so desperately needed. As Charles engaged with the officers, Susan emerged from the shadows of the staircase, her face pale and tear-streaked. Her eyes met Helen's for a brief moment, a silent exchange of gratitude, fear, and hope. Helen knew that whatever happened next, they had taken the first step towards something different. The future was uncertain, but in that moment, Helen felt a glimmer of hope that Susan's life might finally begin to change. In her room, Susan sat on the edge of her bed, attempting to block out the sounds of the commotion downstairs. She closed her eyes and let her mind drift back to happier times, memories of her mother, Dorothy, that seemed to belong to a different lifetime. There was one particular day she often revisited in her thoughts, a day before the separation, when the world still felt warm and safe. It had been a bright afternoon, and Susan remembered laughing with her mother as they ran through a field, the sun on their faces, the wind in their hair. It was a memory she held onto like a lifeline, a beacon of love and freedom in a life that had become increasingly suffocating. Downstairs, after the tense exchange with Charles, the officers called Helen over for a statement. She approached them with a heavy heart, each step feeling as though it carried the weight of the world. She hoped, prayed that her words might make a difference, that her deep concern for Susan would be enough to spark some form of change. "Officers, all I want is the best for Susan," Helen began, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "She's a sweet, intelligent girl who is being forced into a life she never chose, a life that's making her miserable." The words flowed from her, each one a plea for someone to see what she had seen, to recognize the suffering that Susan endured daily. One of the officers, his expression sympathetic, nodded as he listened. "We understand your concern, ma'am, and we're documenting everything you've told us. But without concrete evidence, or the child's own statement confirming these allegations, our hands are somewhat tied." His voice was calm, but Helen could hear the frustration beneath the professionalism, the same frustration she felt in her bones. The law, it seemed, was limited in ways that left those most vulnerable without immediate help. Helen had feared this outcome, yet hearing the words left her feeling desolate, as if all her efforts had been for nothing. "So there's nothing you can do right now?" she asked, her voice tight with desperation. "Is that what you're telling me?" The other officer stepped forward, his tone gentle yet firm. "For now, no. But we are here if the situation changes, if there's another witness, if more concrete evidence emerges. We're taking Mr. Moore to the station for questioning, but he will likely be released unless charges are brought. We need more than suspicion to take legal action." His words trailed off, leaving the reality of the situation hanging in the air like a dark cloud. It was a tacit invitation to stay vigilant, to not give up, even if the immediate outcome seemed bleak. Helen nodded, though the weight of what they said pressed heavily on her chest. As the officers left with Charles, she made her way back inside, feeling the crushing burden of helplessness settle over her. She found Susan waiting anxiously, her eyes filled with a mixture of hope and fear. The sight of her, so vulnerable, made Helen's heart ache even more. With a sigh that seemed to carry the weight of a lifetime, Helen sat down beside her. "Susan," she began, her voice faltering, "they said they can't do anything right now. My statement, it's not enough. Without proof, without something more concrete, there's not much that can be done." Susan, who had been holding back tears, finally let them fall. The words hit her like a wave of despair, and she felt herself break down, her emotions crashing over her like a tidal wave. "So we're alone in this," she whispered, her voice barely audible, more to herself than to Helen. The reality of the situation of being trapped with no immediate escape wrapped around her like a suffocating fog. Helen reached out, pulling Susan into a gentle embrace. "You're not alone, Susan. I'm here with you. We'll figure something out. We just have to stay strong, okay? We'll find a way through this." Her words were soft, filled with love, but even as she spoke them, Helen couldn't shake the fear that they might not be enough. Still, she held Susan tightly, refusing to let go, determined to protect her in whatever way she could. The house was quiet now, the echoes of the confrontation fading into the distance. But in that quiet, Helen and Susan clung to each other, searching for a way forward in a world that seemed intent on keeping them trapped in the darkness. Together, Helen and Susan spent the rest of the night in a heavy, somber silence, their shared sadness only deepening the bond that had grown between them. The despair in the air was palpable, but there was also a sense of unity, a quiet understanding that they were no longer facing this darkness alone. The night had not yet ended when Charles Moore returned from the police station, and his expression was one of barely contained fury. His eyes were cold, his jaw clenched as he stormed through the front door. Without a word of explanation, he turned to Helen, his voice sharp and unfeeling. "You are fired. Pack your things and leave my house," he commanded, his words as cutting as the cold wind that began to howl outside. There was no room for negotiation, no chance for her to defend herself. Though shocked by the abruptness of his decision, Helen wasn't surprised. She had known, deep down, that her attempt to help Susan had sealed her fate in that house. With tears in her eyes, she gathered her belongings, each item a painful reminder of the years she had dedicated to the Moore family, years that had now come to an end because of one brave act. She kept her dignity intact, refusing to let Charles see the full extent of her heartbreak. Charles didn't bother to watch as she packed. Instead, he ruthlessly threw her bags outside into the pouring rain, indifferent to the storm or to the woman he was casting out. Helen felt the cold night air mix with the chill in her heart as she stood on the doorstep, the rain soaking through her clothes. She turned one last time to the house, her eyes searching for Susan. "I'm so sorry, Susan," she whispered to herself, her voice carrying the weight of a final farewell. "I promise I'll do what I can from out here for you." With that, Helen turned and walked away from the Moore mansion, the rain falling steadily around her. The streets were slick with water, but the rain did nothing to wash away the heaviness she felt in her chest. As she moved further away from the only home she had known for so long, her thoughts remained with Susan. What will happen to her now, Helen wondered, each step feeling more burdensome than the last. Despite the distance growing between her and the mansion, she clung to the hope that, somehow, Susan would find a way to break free from the oppressive life that had been forced upon her. After what felt like hours of walking through the storm, Helen finally arrived at her small apartment, just a short distance from the Moore mansion. The space, though modest, offered a sense of quiet comfort, a refuge from the turbulence of the night. She dropped her bags by the door, her body heavy with exhaustion, but even as she lay down on her bed, her mind refused to rest. Thoughts of Susan swirled endlessly in her head, preventing her from finding peace. As she stared up at the ceiling, an idea began to take shape, emerging like a flash of hope in the darkness. "Dorothy," Helen whispered to herself. Susan's mother, the thought of contacting Dorothy grew stronger with each passing minute. Maybe Dorothy doesn't know what's happening. Maybe she doesn't know how much Susan is suffering. Maybe she can help. Helen turned over in bed, her mind racing with possibilities. The memory of Dorothy's address, which she had carefully written down earlier, became a beacon of hope. This could be the way she thought, her determination growing as the first rays of dawn seeped through the curtains. "I have to try. For Susan." As the morning light began to fill her small apartment, Helen knew that her next step would be to reach out to Dorothy. She didn't know what the outcome would be, but she couldn't let fear hold her back. There was too much at stake: Susan's future, her happiness, her freedom. Helen would do whatever it took to ensure that Susan had a chance at the life she deserved, even if it meant confronting the unknown. With renewed purpose, Helen rose from her bed, ready to face the new day. There was no time to waste. Helen rose with newfound determination, rummaging through her belongings in search of the crumpled piece of paper that held Dorothy's address. She finally found it in the pocket of a pair of old, worn pants, a reminder of a time when reaching out to Dorothy seemed unnecessary, just a precaution for an emergency she had hoped would never come. But now, that emergency had arrived, and the address was no longer just a note, it was a lifeline for Susan. Armed with the address and a heart heavy with worry yet buoyed by hope, Helen hailed a taxi. The drive to the neighboring city, where Dorothy lived, felt agonizingly long, each mile intensifying her anxiety. She stared out the window, watching the world pass by in a blur, her mind racing with thoughts of what lay ahead. This confrontation could change everything, she thought, her stomach twisting with a mixture of fear and anticipation. Susan's future hinged on the outcome of this meeting, and the weight of that responsibility pressed down on Helen like never before. When Dorothy's house finally came into view, it was exactly as Susan had described: a large but modest home with an air of simplicity that stood in stark contrast to the cold opulence of the Moore mansion. There was a quiet beauty to it, a sense of warmth and history in its weathered walls. The house seemed to beckon Helen forward, promising refuge and understanding. Stepping out of the taxi, Helen approached the entrance, her heart pounding in her chest. Doubts clawed at her mind. Am I doing the right thing? Is this really the best way to help Susan, she wondered, hesitating for a brief moment. But then she remembered the sound of Susan's desperate cries, the pain in her eyes, and any uncertainty evaporated. For Susan, she whispered to herself, the words steadying her nerves and giving her the strength to move forward. With trembling hands, Helen knocked on the door. Each knock reverberated not only through the old wood but through her very soul, echoing her hope and fear. She waited in tense silence, every second stretching into eternity, until the door finally opened. Dorothy stood before her, her face a mixture of surprise and cautious curiosity. Her eyes, though softened by years of kindness, were clouded with uncertainty as she took in the sight of this unfamiliar woman on her doorstep. "Can I help you?" Dorothy asked, her voice gentle, reflecting a sweetness that belied the tension of the moment. "My name is Helen," she began, trying to steady her voice. "I used to work for Charles, Susan's father. I need to talk to you about your daughter. It's urgent, something that can't wait another moment. I believe Susan is in danger." Helen's words were firm, but the urgency and concern behind them were undeniable. Dorothy's expression shifted from curiosity to concern. She stepped back, opening the door wider. "Please come in. What's happened to Susan?" she asked, her voice now tinged with fear as she led Helen into the warmth of her home. The interior was as simple and inviting as Helen had imagined, so different from the cold, sterile atmosphere of the Moore mansion. Here, there was life, love, and a sense of safety that had long been absent from Susan's world. They sat across from each other in the cozy living room, the soft light filtering through the curtains, casting a warm glow over everything. Helen took a deep breath, gathering her thoughts before speaking. "Susan is suffering, Dorothy. Charles is forcing her into a modeling career, something she hates with every fiber of her being. He controls everything she does, from what she eats to who she can talk to. Last night I overheard a terrible argument. He threatened to cut her food, to take away even more of her freedom. Susan is desperate, Dorothy. She's trapped." Each word was spoken with conviction, with the weight of someone who had witnessed far too much pain. Tears welled up in Dorothy's eyes as she listened, her heart breaking with every revelation. I knew Charles was strict, but this is too much, she whispered, her voice trembling. I always feared Susan would get caught in that world Charles wanted for her, but I never imagined it had gotten this bad. The pain of not being there for her daughter, of not knowing the extent of her suffering, was evident in every word. Helen reached out, taking Dorothy's hand in hers, offering what comfort she could. I know it's hard, but I believe we can help Susan together. You're her mother, Dorothy. Your voice carries weight, more than mine ever could. If you're willing to stand up to Charles, to give your testimony, we can protect Susan. Helen's eyes met Dorothy's, her gaze unwavering and filled with determination. Though still shaken, Dorothy's expression hardened with resolve. You're right, Helen. I'll do whatever it takes to protect my daughter. I won't let her suffer any longer at the hands of that man. I'll testify. I'll fight for her. Her voice grew stronger with each word, the sweetness of her nature now tempered with the fierce determination of a mother ready to do whatever it took to save her child. Without hesitation, Dorothy picked up the phone and dialed the police station in Charles's city. Hello, my name is Dorothy Moore. I'm the mother of Susan Moore, and I need to give a statement about her father, Charles Moore. It's an urgent matter, she said, her voice steady and resolute. After making the arrangements, Dorothy and Helen headed to the police station, their hearts filled with a mixture of anxiety and determination. They knew they were walking into a battle, but it was one they were ready to fight. Meanwhile, Charles, sensing the walls closing in around him, began to plot his next move. Alone in his office, Charles brooded over the recent turn of events, his mind racing with thoughts of losing control, not just over the situation, but over Susan herself. If Dorothy finds out about this and decides to fight for custody, if the police start to believe these ridiculous accusations, I can't let that happen, he thought, convincing himself that everything he had done was justified. Susan is my responsibility. I know what's best for her. The idea of fleeing began to take root in his mind, a desperate plan to escape the consequences of his actions. If we disappear for a while, until things calm down. Yes, that could work, Charles concluded, the twisted logic of his plan taking hold. Acting quickly, Charles found Susan and told her they needed to take a sudden trip. It's for your own good, Susan. Trust me. Don't ask questions. I'm your father, and I only want what's best for you, he insisted, guiding his reluctant and confused daughter to the car. Back at the police station, Dorothy was giving her testimony, her voice steady as she recounted everything she knew about Charles's controlling behavior. Charles has always been strict, but this is different. Susan doesn't deserve to live like this, under constant pressure and unhappiness. She deserves to be free, to choose her own path, she explained to the officers, her words filled with both pain and determination. The officers listened carefully, taking note of every detail. Your testimony could be crucial, Dorothy. We'll do everything we can to ensure Susan's safety, one of them assured her. Soon, a patrol car was sent to Charles's house, but they found it empty. Suspecting that he might be trying to flee, they took to the city streets in search of his vehicle. It wasn't long before they spotted a car matching his description. Cautiously, they began to follow at a safe distance, keeping an eye on the movements inside. Susan, sitting in the passenger seat, felt a growing sense of fear and confusion. Where are we going, Dad? What's happening? Why are we leaving the city so suddenly, she asked, her voice trembling. Everything's fine, Susan, Charles replied, trying to maintain his composure. We just need some time away from all this, until things calm down. But the police weren't far behind. When the time was right, the patrol car turned on its siren, signaling Charles to pull over. As the car came to a stop, the officers approached cautiously, their eyes trained on the man who had caused so much harm. Mr. Moore, step out of the vehicle with your hands where we can see them, one of the officers commanded, his voice firm and authoritative. Charles complied, his face a mask of conflicting emotions: anger, fear, and desperation, all battling for dominance. This can't be happening, he thought as he was led away by the police. Everything I did was for Susan's future. His mind clung to the justifications he had built around his actions, unable to see the damage he had caused. Susan, separated from her father and placed in another police car, sat in stunned silence. Her mind raced with questions. What happens now? Will things really change? I just wish Mom were here, she thought, feeling both relieved and terrified. When they arrived at the police station, Susan saw Dorothy and Helen waiting for her. Overcome with emotion, she ran toward them, her words tumbling out in a rush. Mom, Helen, I was so scared. I didn't know if you would find me. I didn't know if I'd see you again. She cried, her voice filled with relief and gratitude. Dorothy, tears streaming down her face, pulled her daughter into a tight embrace. Oh, Susan, I'm so sorry for everything you've been through. But you're safe now. We're going to take care of you. Everything will be okay, she promised, her voice full of love and reassurance. An officer approached them, ready to explain the situation. Ladies, I want you to know that Charles Moore has been arrested on several serious charges, including emotional abuse and neglect. Your testimony, along with the evidence we've gathered, was critical in making this arrest possible, he said, outlining the legal process that would follow and emphasizing the seriousness of the charges. Helen, standing beside them, felt a complex mixture of relief and sadness. Susan, this means you won't have to go back to that house, to that life. We'll find a way to rebuild, to make you feel safe and loved again, she said, her commitment to supporting Susan as strong as ever. With Dorothy and Helen by her side, Susan allowed herself to hope for the first time in what felt like forever. Maybe now I can finally be me, she thought, the possibility of a new beginning taking root in her heart. As the officer stepped away, Dorothy turned to Helen with a grateful smile and an idea. Helen, you lost your job because you did what was right for Susan. I was thinking, how would you feel about coming to work with us? I'd love to have you around, and I know Susan would too, she offered, her eyes shining with appreciation. Helen, taken aback by the offer, felt a wave of emotion wash over her. I would be honored, she said, her voice thick with gratitude. Nothing would make me happier than continuing to be part of Susan's life, and now yours too. Susan, overhearing their conversation, felt her heart swell with happiness. This is going to be amazing. Helen makes the best cake, she exclaimed, her voice bubbling with excitement as she realized that her new life would be filled with love and support. 2 months passed since that fateful day at the police station, and life at Dorothy's house had transformed into a haven of peace and new beginnings. Laughter filled the air, and the warmth of their shared love created an atmosphere of healing and hope, a stark contrast to the darkness of Susan's past. Mom, Helen, I got a high grade on my essay about happiness, Susan announced one morning during breakfast, her face glowing with pride. I wrote about how happiness is found in the little things, like having my mom and Helen around. Dorothy beamed, exchanging a knowing look with Helen. That's wonderful, sweetheart. We're so proud of you. Seeing you happy is the greatest gift we could ever ask for, she said, her voice full of love and contentment. Meanwhile, far away in jail, Charles Moore sat brooding, his thoughts consumed with anger and resentment. They'll regret this. They don't know what they've done, he thought bitterly, unable to feel any remorse for his actions, even as he faced years behind bars. Back at Dorothy's house, life continued in its new rhythm, a rhythm of healing, love, and rebuilding. The past still lingered in their memories, but it no longer held them captive. Together, they had created a future filled with possibility and light. You know, I never imagined we could be so happy after everything we've been through, Helen said one afternoon as she helped Susan with her homework. And I never imagined I'd have the chance to be simply happy again, Susan replied, a genuine smile lighting up her face. But here we are, me, my mom, and you, my best friend. Her voice was filled with gratitude for the life she now lived, a life filled with love, support, and the freedom to just be herself. And so, amidst the laughter, the learning, and the shared moments of joy, the story of Susan, Dorothy, and Helen continued a testament to the power of love, resilience, and the human capacity to rebuild and start anew. Justice, though it had taken time, had brought peace to their lives, and the future they had once only dreamed of was now their reality. Now that you've experienced Susan's journey from hardship to freedom, we'd love to hear from you. What have you learned from this story so far? Please comment below with one thing you've learned and how you plan to bring it into practice in your own life. Let's keep this conversation going and inspire each other to create positive change. If you like this video, please leave your comment below and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel.